the African accountancy profession, are we seizing the opportunity to be part of, to contribute, and to drive the rise of Africa? Are we bystanders, or are we active participants? I think for me, the answer to that question is that yes. The mere fact that we are here, the mere fact that we are discussing, that we are having this dialogue means that we as accountants don't want to be seen as bystanders. We as accountants want to be seen to be playing our rightful role. So the second question is how? How are we seizing this opportunity? And I think the session today, we will be exploring how we are seizing the opportunity as professionals. We have before you a panel that is drawn from different sectors. To my far right, we have Michael, who is from the ICAEW. He's the regional director responsible for Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Next to him, we have Jean Wameo. Jean is with the African Development Bank, responsible for public financial management matters. To my extreme left, we have Renaud Seligman. He is responsible for public financial management issues in Africa with the World Bank. And then we have Anthony Boateng. He chairs the Research and Development Panel of CIMA, but he's based in Ghana. Together, they have a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of experiences on how we can contribute to building sustainable institutions, building human capacity, because without sustainable institutions, without human capacity, without strong PAOs, without strong accountants, we cannot be effective in contributing to Africa's rise as a profession. In IFAC, we believe that PAOs have the capacity to contribute to strong and sustainable economies. But for the PAOs to realize that potential, they also need to be strengthened. So within IFAC, the issue of strengthening PAOs, and then through strong PAOs, we can then have strong accountants, both in the public sector, in the private sector, and these accountants can then be able to contribute to growing their economies. So I want to start by asking my panelists a few questions, and then after some time, we will then ask you, the audience, to also ask them some questions. Our session is as interactive as possible. We want to share experiences so that by the end of ACOA 2015, when we go back to our respective countries, we will be taking back tangible lessons that we can implement, tangible things and actions that we can, or projects that we can implement as a profession as we seek to drive our countries to the growth that our countries deserve. So when I look at Africa, I find that in many of our African countries, we depend a lot on government. Government is supposed to be the enabler of growth. Government is supposed to drive economic growth. Government is the one that has the resources. However, one of the challenges that we face is that there's lack of transparency, lack of accountability. If you listen to the session in the morning, that was also mentioned, that we need to have accountable, transparent governments who are able to utilize the resources that we have, that the governments have, for the benefit of the people. So I'd like to start by asking Jean, what are some of the initiatives that the African Development Bank has been pursuing to strengthen, especially public sector institutions, such as the Supreme Audit institutions, the internal audit function, generally to strengthen transparency and accountability within government?
Okay. Thank you, Caroline. Maybe I'll just start by saying something that our President, Dr. Kaberuka, likes saying to us. He said that once when he was on one of his trips, somebody asked him, whose Africa is rising? Do we as Africans really believe that Africa is rising, or is it just something that we say? And this was when the African Development Bank was working on its 10-year strategy. And I presuppose in answering that question, a lot of the things have been said in the session this morning and as well yesterday. about the fact that indeed Africa is rising, there is growth, but there is then the paradox of the fact that there's really a substantial number of people who are not really benefiting from that growth. And those people are asking themselves, whose Africa is rising? Maybe it's my Africa that's rising and not Caroline's Africa. And in answering that question, one of the pillars that we have, or one of the priorities that we have in the African Development Bank 10-year strategy, we have about 5 operational priorities. And 2 of them really link a lot to some of the things that we're discussing at ACOA 2015 and the question that Caroline has just asked me. Governance and accountability, skills and technology. There are also other things around infrastructure development. One of the speakers talked about regional integration, not just about roads, but also about the soft infrastructure in terms of being able to make sure that we have the same issues relating to the infrastructure that is necessary to make sure that everybody's Africa is rising. So specifically to answer her question in terms of the initiatives, a lot of the programs that we do at the African Development Bank, even though infrastructure, and that's hard infrastructure, is the main thing that we concentrate on, you know, like, and a lot of people are talking about roads, railways, in order to connect and enable inter-Africa trade. One of the things that has been a discussion and very central is the accountability behind the funds that not just we lend, but also the funds that these countries, the countries themselves collect. And people have said to us that, although as accountants we think that or rather we have been taught to believe that private sector is really the engine of growth, about 70 or even 80% in some countries, or close to 90, comes through the public sector. And in that regard, therefore, the supreme audit institutions, the government central internal audit is really key in ensuring that there is efficiency and effectiveness of the monies that are collected by governments. And so where does the African Development Bank come in? In most of the countries that we work in, I think in fact in all the countries, we have public financial management as a central role. And a lot of money is given to countries to make sure that they're able to build capacity, both the hard, and the hard is some of the supreme audit institutions, some of the internal audit institutions do not even have things like maybe buildings, computers, etc. So in those countries, we're able to fund through the PFM pillars items like that. In some other countries that are slightly different, they have the hard infrastructure in terms of the size and the internal audit. They actually don't have, they want to improve. They don't have training, they don't have audit manuals. There are just many things that they don't have in order for them to be the supreme audit institution or the internal audit that is able to be there to take the opportunity in Africa Rising and make sure that holding governments to account. And I'm not going to come and talk about everything that we've done in every country, but in a lot of Africa is not one country. There are some countries where the capacity is weak and there is nothing. And therefore we work through the country strategy papers with that particular country to ensure that the country knows what they want and dialoguing with them and trying to find out what does this country need vis-a-vis what does that other country need in terms of being able to build up the capacity and framework that they require in terms of making their countries more accountable and transparent. And Caroline, I'll come back later, I think, with the questions, and I'll let the other...
Okay, so thank you, Jean. So the idea that, yes, you have an Africa strategy, but it must be tailored to the different countries. Countries, you must start to understand your needs before somebody can come in and assist you to rise. Renaud, I know you also work quite a lot with African countries in the areas of public financial management reforms, in the areas of enhancing transparency, enhancing accountability. What are some of the reforms that you've undertaken, and what impact has those reforms had on accountability and transparency and in better use of public resources? Because without good use of public resources, Africa cannot rise.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Caroline, and it's a great pleasure to be back here for this ACOA plenary session. And unlike what some of you might think, if you Google ACOA, it comes up with something quite different than the African Congress of Accountants. It comes up with adult children of alcoholics. So just to clarify, this is not for adult children of alcoholics, this is indeed the African Congress of Accountants. I think what we are doing jointly with our partners at the African Development Bank in support of greater transparency in the public sector is fundamental to the transformation agenda of the continent. As we saw yesterday, we have growth, but that growth doesn't always translate into better lives for the majority of the population, more jobs, more opportunities, and also into sustainable development. And what we mean by this is that a lot of African countries are rich in extractives, in resources that are non-renewable. So unless they translate these into investments in capital infrastructure, as Jean was just saying, or in human capital, they will have, in a generation's time or in 2 generations' time, they will have depleted their resources and they will not have built for the future. So governance is a critical part of that equation. So going straight to your question, in relation to supreme audit institutions, we feel that they are a very critical part of the governance equation because they can provide an independent perspective on how the executive is doing in terms of managing public resources. I mean, this is a topic that is particularly dear to my heart. As you know, I come from a supreme audit institution as a part of my professional background, and I have seen in a lot of African countries how much of a difference they can make when they are truly independent and when they act in a professional manner. And I see Terence sitting over there as past president of the African Association of Supreme Audit Institutions and the International Association. I'm sure he will agree with us. Let me give you a few examples of what we are doing and the results we have achieved. Let me go back to the issue of Ebola. So, as you know, as part of the Ebola crisis, we've had to ramp up very, very significantly the support we provided to healthcare providers and to people working in the health sector in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. What happened last September, really, is that these people were scared and they were not showing up for work, and the health centers were deserted. And we had more and more people just dying in the streets and not being taken care of. And so when the presidents of the 3 countries met with the bank's president, with Jim Kim, they said, if you can do one thing with us, help us ensure that these people are getting paid and that they get hazard pay, that their families get taken care of if they suffer in the epidemic, because of course a lot of the early victims of the epidemics were health workers themselves. And so you had a vicious circle that was happening. And so what we needed to set up was a very large scheme to pay thousands and thousands of people who were providing healthcare in these really hazardous circumstances. Now, that was happening in a situation where governance is a big challenge in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, and in Guinea. And I remember being on the phone with Jean, actually, at that time and saying, Jean, you and I are going to have a problem because we're working in this together, but that money is not going to go to the healthcare workers. It's not going to go to the front lines. There's going to be some misappropriation. So what can we do about it? And what we put in place was a system of oversight, right? So we started by cleaning up the payroll list, ensuring that there were proper internal controls, that there was a unique identifier for these people receiving the money, that there were some checks that were performed at the time when the payment was made. Because initially what happened is that bags of cash were just handed out, to people with absolutely no way to trace who was getting paid and why. So we set up a system with payrolls, with identifiers, and then we mobilized internal audit. And so the internal audit went on site with the police, the army, they've witnessed who was getting paid and why. And then we moved to an electronic payment system, and then we got the external auditor involved. And they were able, because of the capacity we've been providing to them over the years, they were able to actually provide an audit opinion on how that system was actually functioning. And they were very proud of being able to say, okay, we've looked at all of that funding up until now, and actually there are some issues here. Here's what needs to be fixed. Here's where the accountability lies. And that was hugely important to the people of the affected countries who didn't trust their governments to manage these funds responsibly, but also to the international community, who was pouring millions and millions of dollars to fight that emergency, and who knew, as a result of what was being done, that they would be handled properly. Let me give you another example in the area of internal audit, and then I'll stop here. In the area of internal audit, what we find is that there's often a very fragmented approach to internal audit. If you go to maybe a francophone country, you will find a state general inspectorate, a finance inspectorate, inspectorates in education, health, etc. And it's very much an inspection model, and not so much a model that is based on risk-based internal audit. So what we have done in a number of countries like Burkina Faso and Mali and Senegal, as well as in Sudan and other places, and taking some inspiration from what's happened actually in your country, Caroline, in Kenya, we've developed a program of risk-based internal audit where there's a risk mapping of the public sector, and on the basis of that risk mapping, internal audit can focus its efforts where there's the biggest risk for the public purse. That, of course, increases the value added of internal audit, and it allows internal audit to move from a marginalized function to one that becomes central to the political agenda and to the agenda of ministers. And so that has yielded some very significant results. For instance, in Burkina Faso, with a change of regime following the fall of government Compaoré, the High Authority for State Oversight, which is the internal audit chief executive, is now launching an investigation into the stolen assets of the regime with support from the bank and others. Finally, let me say that while support to supreme audit institutions and to internal audit entities is very critical, what is even more critical is making the connection with citizens. Making the connection with citizens, having that connection between the supply side of the governance equation, how well you're doing in terms of identifying issues and bringing them to the surface, and the demand side, the citizens themselves, the media, being able to put pressure on the executive to ensure that there is accountability and there is transparency. And the critical element there is the transparency factor. Being able to leverage new technology to ensure that, for instance, citizens are able to say, are schools being attended by teachers, are health centers, are health care providers present in the health centers? That is the new frontier, making the connection between the supply and the demand side.
Okay, thank you, Renaud. Essentially, challenging the profession to be innovative in how we approach issues of accountability and transparency, and to connect with the citizens. I like the example of the Ebola scare and how that was tackled in a way that citizens felt their money was well utilized. It enhances the trust that they have in government. So any subsequent projects that come from government, citizens will be able to rally behind those particular projects. So those are very good lessons that we are learning and that we can take back. Now to the other side of the coin. We've looked at public sector, the institutions, how we are strengthening them. But on the other side of that coin lies the private sector. And I remember when we were in school, learning accountancy, when I was learning accountancy, there always a question, where was the accountant? Where was the auditor? Anytime something went wrong, where was the accountant? Where was the auditor? I also used to sing that song until when I joined the profession, I realized not everybody who says they're an accountant is actually an accountant. Mm-hmm. Not everybody who says they're an auditor is actually an auditor. But the citizen out there did not understand. So yes, there's been concern about accountability, transparency in the public sector, but the private sector is accused of being culpable, is accused of promoting. Sometimes we don't do enough to prevent, to enhance accountability. We don't speak out enough as a profession when cases of transparency, cases of corruption occur, we don't prosecute enough of our own fellow accountants who sully the name of the profession. So I'd like to ask Michael, you've been working with PAOs, trying to strengthen PAOs so that they can be seen as protectors of the public interest. What are some of the initiatives you've undertaken to strengthen PAOs, and what has been the impact of that?
No.
Could you put it closer to you?
Maybe you can.
I think, okay. So if they can come and help us, and we will ask Anthony from
Okay.
CIMA. It's working?
No.
They can't hear you. So let's go to Anthony.
Hello,
Mine
can
is
you
working,
hear me?
isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Let's go to Anthony.
Is mine working?
Yes. We can
Good,
hear.
good morning. Okay. Thank you, Caroline. I think with CIMA and AICPA, where we get the CGMA designation, we're looking at strengthening, the PAO in terms of thought leadership. I mean, one of the issues we have realized is that PAOs have to be relevant in their dealings, both in the public and the private sector. So we have an issue whereby the public sector actually faces the exact same issues in the private sector. And we aggregate towards helping more of the private sector and neglecting the public sector in some ways. So the CGMA qualification is hitting down for us to know that, our qualification is relevant both in the public and the private sector. An example would be that in the private sector, there are issues of managing expenditure. The composition of the expenditure portfolio is an issue. Matching infrastructural investments with actual financial tools is a challenge. You see infrastructural investments being financed by different financial tools in terms of long-term, short-term, not matching it right. I mean, this has been the advice we've been giving the private sector over the years. So the skills are transferable. We can actually move our skills from what we've been using in the private sector into the public sector. So relevance is a key issue for us. And also, we hammer on trust. We think trust is the bedrock, of being a trusted broker in a way, to having the convening power, bringing policymakers as well as industry giants on the table to trash out their issues, and making sure that both parties are, I would say, transformational agents in the developmental agenda. So trust is a big thing in the PAOs, and I mean, especially in CIMA and AICPA. I mean, what we're hammering down is that we have to be ethical in our dealings and also have the interest of the client, in this case, the country at heart. And once this is done, you get the influence from both parties, and you position yourself as not being biased to the private sector or the public sector, but becoming an independent broker in the issues at hand. And lastly, we look at value, adding value in whatever we do. And I think it is much more prevalent in our side of the world that we are poor in a very rich continent. And we can say that the figures always look right, but the people are suffering. So there is some form of a disconnect. And adding value in terms of your scarce resources, I think, has to be in the center of the composition of PAOs. So in our thought leadership publication, which is the Global Management Accounting Principle, we highlight these outcomes, which are relevance, influence, trust, and value. And we think it's something we're pushing. And I'm glad that Reno from the World Bank and Jean from ADB are here, because I think it is a publication that will help the public sector to bring some form of sanity in operations and also streamline activities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anthony, for that. Again, running themes. Make sure you have the right skills. Skills that are relevant, skills that are transferable from both private sector to the public sector, and skills that will be able to deal with the emerging challenges. He's talking about infrastructure. How do you, as a professional accountant, do you have the right skill to support this huge infrastructure projects? And that's something we'll come back to later on in the session. I would like to give Michael the opportunity to then tell us what ICAW is doing, the experience you've had across Africa, how are you strengthening the PAOs, how are you helping them build capacity? What can PAOs do to strengthen themselves and be
Caroline,
relevant?
thank you very much indeed. I'm hoping you can hear me now. I think you can. Thank you for the question. I'll come on to that. But also thank you for Reno for clarifying that I'm at the right conference, because my notes didn't allow me to speak on adult children of alcoholics. But certainly, I think I'm not going to immediately answer the question, is the accounting profession accused of not doing enough? Because whatever the answer to that is, I think we can always do more. And I just wanted to share with you that how ICAW has approached this aspect of capacity and working together with the PAOs to make sure they're strong and sustainable. I think this is the emphasis I would give. Just to share with you that across the globe, we've, since 2007, we've been involved in some 25 initiatives and programs. But here in Africa, since 2009, we have been involved with 7 countries, Botswana, Ghana, Malawi, Kenya, Zambia, also Tanzania, and Nigeria, of course. And we heard a very interesting introduction this morning from Annan, and I just think that this works well together. What I wanted to emphasize was that our approach, the ICAW approach, is very much capacity building, needs to promote sustainable, strong PAOs, but not dependency. And I think it's important to get that balance. And when we structure our projects, we're very keen to make we have clear scope and identify a clear exit route. It's not that we are there in perpetuity, because then if that's the case, we wouldn't have succeeded. And we are keen and we seek to provide solutions that have tangible, identifiable outcomes over the development of the agreed life cycle of the project. But what we do, we focus in a number of areas with PAOs, and it's not one size fits all. It depends on the various stages of development of the PAOs. I think it was Olivier yesterday from IFAC. Olivier Kirtley mentioned that in Africa, 56 countries, some 40% of those countries don't have PAOs at the moment. But where we go to and can assist and work in partnership with the PAOs, there are a number of, I suppose, key focus areas to help make sure they establish, maintain, develop high-quality professional accountancy qualifications that underpins the operation. Also to make sure that they extend their services to meet their members' and business needs, whether it's CPD, or as I heard from Annan this morning, MCPD, and the monitoring of CPD. Also, to work together with the PAOs to make sure they have developed a proper governance and capacity themselves. And so there's influence and scope, so they achieve a transparency that's expected by society and give them the confidence. What I would like to mention as the fourth area, which is audit quality monitoring, where we've managed to assist in a number of countries, like Ghana, for example. I think this is an important aspect when we go back to the question of what are we doing to support the profession in accountability and preventing corruption. And when I look at audit quality monitoring, I think there's two aspects to this. Yes, there is the discipline of robust and solid audits, but equally it's making sure there is responsibility taken by the corporates themselves to make sure management are professional accountants. The management are trained with the right skills and have the ethics inculcated, the right tone at the top. Because when you have that, you have professional accountants working within an organization together with robust and strong auditors. I think you can make inroads to make people aware of where fraud might exist, and then develop procedures to identify and alleviate those aspects. I would also say that it's not just with the management, but the auditor needs to have a sense of professional skepticism. So often I see with auditors, in their eagerness to complete on time, or perhaps that means cost-effective audits, I'm not sure, but certainly in their eagerness to complete on time, they tend, as a generalization, to rely too heavily on management assurances and not check those with logical checks and have a healthy sense of skepticism. So that's an area where I would encourage professional accountants and accounting bodies to work together to develop further. I think that it's all very well talking about the auditors, the accountants, and the management. But equally, I think I would like to also flag the issue of the PAOs themselves, that they have to make sure that they do, in fact, keep their own house in order and are perceived to do that. And basically, they need to make sure that there is a level of enforcement, effective enforcement of the IFAC Code of Ethics, also making sure that they have effective and appropriate and trusted compliance and complaints disciplinary schemes so that they can raise the profile and robustness of the profession itself. And I think if we get this and the profession takes ownership to lead by example, then we can in fact make inroads into this ever-present problem of leakage or corruption and so forth. So thank you for that.
So the linkage between a strong PAO with the necessary capacity to support the professional accountant, and the professional accountant with the necessary skills to be able to support the organization they work in, whether this organization be in the private sector or whether this is within the public sector. There are a number of themes that are running through the presentations that we are receiving. One of the things that Jean mentioned was that in Africa, the engine of growth is essentially government. And one of the things governments are embarking upon is huge projects, infrastructure projects, etc. But at times, in my country, and I'm sure in a lot of your countries, I'm sure you've had the experience where towards the end of the fiscal year, a lot of ministries, a lot of government departments, a lot of government agencies will be returning money. They had budgeted for it, they're unable to spend it. And they're returning money back to Treasury, saying that we were unable to complete one project or the other. If we are to rise as Africa, if we are to fulfill our potential as Africa, we cannot be returning the money and saying that we were unable to undertake various projects. Sometimes it gets very frustrating. I mean, it's like you've given your child money and told them to go, and they've told you, I want to spend money on 1, 2, 3 things. Can you imagine a scenario where your child comes back and says, Mom, I was unable to spend 50% of what you gave me? Is that possible? Or you go to your board and say, I was unable to spend this much, I was unable to execute these projects, now I'm returning back the money. But we allow our governments to do that every year. And one of the reasons that's been cited is that we lack the capacity. So Jean, I don't know, as you finance these huge projects and help governments to implement huge infrastructure projects, how can we as an accountancy profession build the capacity to support those infrastructure projects? How can we increase our numbers? Yesterday, Renaud told us we have less than 100,000 accountants for 1 billion people in Africa. How can we increase the numbers? How can we get not just the numbers, but also the right skills to support these emerging sectors?
Okay, Caroline, maybe I'll start by saying, again, what we all know because we're accountants is that Africa is not a country, because one country is very different from the other country. And some of the challenges that some countries have are very different from other countries. And I'll just give 2 examples. After the Arab Spring, when we were doing the country strategy paper for Tunisia, because I had attended ACOA in Nairobi, so I was really very interested in the convergence between the public and the private sector. One of the first things I did was to send what we called, for us as development partners, when we're doing anything in a country, is you start at the level of a country strategy paper or a country national, development plan, because the country themselves know what they want. And one of the first things we did was to take what had been agreed at the level of Tunisia, because Tunisia is the country where the Arab Spring had begun, and we sent the country strategy paper to the PAO for comment and for involvement. And one of the things that we noted was that although Tunisia has relatively a very high number of accountants, very qualified, a body with very qualified people, we didn't get a response back from them. So when I talk about quality and capacity for Tunisia, it's not so much in terms of numbers, but it's more in terms of their interest in the public sector. On the other hand, when we talk about capacity, we have a country like Gambia as well that we've been working with very recently, trying to get an accounting body in place. You have countries like those, or even Angola, where we were trying to work together, where there really is no accounting body. So different countries are different. And the question is that what can we do? What we did this year in terms of being able to resolve those problems, well, not resolve, but to assist resolve those problems, is we talked to PAFA, to Mr. Nkube, and we said, why can't we be able to look at this more at a global perspective and have a unit, an organization like PAFA, map out for all the 54 countries in Africa, see the ones that have, analyze the PAOs and try and see what are the needs within each country, and perhaps start by addressing the countries that don't even have a PAO. Because what we tend to find is when we're working with people like ECAW and other institutions, even the World Bank and ourselves, it's the countries that have strong PAOs that seem to always have access to further strengthening. And the countries that just have nothing continue being where they're at. And for Africa, therefore, and some of these countries, if you look at Mozambique, extractive industries, resource-rich, countries that are going places, yet they don't even have a PAO that is able to assist and get into the dialogue within countries. So it's at that level that we think that a regional umbrella like PAFA or any other bodies are actually very important in assisting those countries be able to take up their place. So I was just coming back to say that capacity means different things to different PAOs, whereas others are trying to exceed to meet what IFAC wants them to exceed. There are others where there really is nothing. And so from where we sit as the African Development Bank, we've been sitting back and saying that we need to start working very hard in countries that are fragile countries, because those are the countries that have very high resources that create the fragility, countries where we need to invest, countries where there's a lot of growth, and yet those are the countries that don't even have accountants. Another thing, just a second idea was the issue about curriculum. And I liked what the Association of Nigeria said, is that maybe not every country can have an institute that would be able to train accountants, but are we able to have regional institutions? And I'll after this, try to have a discussion with the Nigerians, because a country like Gambia, and some of the things that we were working with them, was that they don't have an institute. The students have to sit ACCA exams or the Ghana exams, and the pass rate is 0%. Zero because, as you all know, sometimes it's actually very difficult to study without the requisite support intended, because you need to go to class, after work, etc. And so a lot of these students, in the first project that we had with them, is that we supported them to sit examinations under the Ghanaian Institute or under the ACCA. But what were the results? The results were that none of those students were actually passed their exams, because they really didn't have that support. And so from where we're sitting is to be able to say, how can we be able to manage that support? And that is also, a lot of the accountants from the Francophone countries will also tell you that that is the challenge that they have in terms of the curriculum, and being able to have a curriculum that is, that first of all applies to their countries, and a curriculum that people can be able to accede to, first of all at the lower levels, and then at the chartered accountancy levels. Because in some of the countries, as you said, Caroline, people are calling themselves accountants, and they're not accountants. And they're not really able to do the work that is required of them as of an accountant. And what we therefore need to do at the level of development partners, in talking to both the PAOs individually, but also the institutions like PAFA, is how we can be able to do this more at a regional or a continental level. Of course, there is the language issue, so we have to consider the Francophone, the Anglophone, and the Lusophone countries as well.
Okay. So there's an opportunity, but there's a challenge in building capacity. We need to do it, but we also need to address the challenges therein. I don't think it's just language and culture, but also we also tend to be very protective of our turf. So in Kenya, I want to have my own CPA. Tanzania, I want to have my own CPA. I don't want to come jointly to see how to build capacity from a regional perspective. I would like to give the panelists a break. I said earlier that the session was going to be interactive. I was told that there was a microphone that would be going round. I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask questions and to contribute to the debate. It is about accountants contributing to the rise of Africa. So if you have any questions, any comments to our panelists, I would like to open discussion for a few minutes. When you provide your question, state your name, where you come from, and let's try and keep your comment as the way one of the presidents in Kenya, former presidents in Kenya, said that a good speech should be like a woman's dress. Short enough to be interesting, but long enough to cover the subject. Let's keep our comments like that. So there is a comment from a gentleman there. So we'll try and get 2 questions at a go, or 3 questions at a go, so that they can answer.
Sorry. I'll try and make the question interesting. The name is Fred Moore, Institute of Chartered Accountants, Ghana. I'd just like to make a few comments on the national bodies compared to international bodies and other things. One of the, I think my lady from the African Development Board mentioned Gambia. To just make a minor correction, Ghana Institute has not started examination in Gambia. What we've done is done examinations in Liberia, where we've had 6 people pass the exams and 4 people become members of the institute. What we try to do when we go to a country is not just go there and give them the examination. We also support them in the training and the tuition so that they can pass the qualification. That's just a minor point.
Okay, so Fred, that's a comment from you. Thank you. And you have passed the test, the litmus test. Any other comment or question? So there's one there. Can I see other hands? I'm a lady, so I'm looking for ladies to speak. So we have 2 hands there. We'll take those. And please, the next ones, can the ladies put up their hand?
Can I speak now? I have the mic here.
I think it is the issue of...
Sorry. Is it you speaking? Or
Yes, I'm speaking.
there's somebody there?
Yes. My name is Professor Omanentri from Institute of Chartered Accountants, Ghana. Africa is rising, that is fine. And whatever has been said over there, you all know we can all get it from the work of the World Bank. I mean, it's a research work that is there. What I'm interested in, and that is why I came, is what can we do as accounting educators? What can we do as professional accountants in business? What can we do as accountants in the public sector? What can we do as accountants in practice to help this rise? I'll be grateful if any of the members can throw more light on most of these things. The others, they are in research work, we have all read it.
Okay, thank you for that question. I'll ask him to give us his question, then I'll give the panel an opportunity to speak.
Thank you, the Chair. I think it is this institutional building and that is a major issue.
Your name first?
I'm Professor Muhammad Mainoma, Anan, Nigeria. The critical issue is the matter that she raised about institutional buildings. And I think that if you look at what happens in Nigeria, for instance, with Nigerian College of Accountancy, it provides an enabling environment where people can learn the practice of accountancy. And then they can sit for any other examination. We have candidates that study in Nigerian College of Accountancy, write ACCA and pass, write other examinations and pass outside the shore of Nigeria. So you find out that Africans can then make use of that accountancy village that is provided in the city of Jos that can enable people understand the practice of accountancy and then use it anywhere in Africa or beyond. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you for that question, Professor Mohammed and Professor Banetti. I'll start with Anthony, if you can, because we've been asked, what exactly can we do as educators?
Okay, I'm looking at an analogy. I know that we like football on this. Hello?
Test, 1, 2.
Are we safe?
Okay, so you can continue.
Yeah, I know we love football on this continent, and I just want to use that as an analogy. I mean, here is the playing field, and you have the players in terms of, we can associate that to the private sector, and you have the referee, the regulator, the public sector, and technical assistance providers, PAOs or professional accountants, providing technical assistance to both the private sector and the public sector, so the players and the umpire. Now, on an ideal game, you have to have a level playing field whereby, the umpire calls the shot. I mean, he can say that there's an infringement, and he can call the winners. And for the umpire to do that, he needs to know the rules very well. Now, here we are. It's not the case in our continent. I mean, the private sector is well versed in the rules. They call the shots when there's an infringement, and they tell you what the punishment should be. And the question now is, who provides that advice to them? In my part of the world, where I come from, we will ask the question, Nahu Kosam. We are supposed to be given the advice that will bring in some form of transparency. So we cannot absorb ourselves from what is happening. So what we can do is to start from home. We have to hammer down our ethical codes. We have to hold our people accountable when things go wrong. There has to be channels of whistleblowing. We have to make sure that when people actually see things go wrong and they report it, we protect them from not being vilified, but rather they are celebrated. Now, if that cleaning exercise can start from us, I think we can get somewhere. So I think we should look at ourselves first. That is where I'll
Okay,
go.
so look at yourself first. Renaud from the World Bank, you've been thrown a challenge.
Yeah, no, I think I want to take it up. Let me start with the public sector, and then I'll say a few words on the private sector dimension of this. And I'll take your very good question on low execution rates for capital budgets. We did a study on execution of capital budget in the 8 West African Economic and Monetary Union countries, from Senegal all the way to Burkina Faso, Benin, Mali, Guinea-Bissau, Côte d'Ivoire, Togo, etc. What we found is that the capital budget execution rates were in the 50 to 65% range, right? So that meant that nearly half of the capital budget was not being spent in countries that are aspiring to become emerging countries. Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, they're aspiring to get there, and they know they have a large infrastructure gap that they need to bridge in order to get there. So the need is clear. The funds are allocated in the budget, but they're not being spent. The interesting thing is, and you're all accountants, so you will understand, is that, of course, you need to distinguish between the budget perspective and the cash perspective. From a cash perspective, all the money that the government receives is being spent, 100% of it, right? It's just that it's not being spent on what was planned. Instead of being spent on building bridges and roads and long-lasting infrastructure, it's used to hire more people, right, for patronage purposes. It's used on operating expenses to finance business class travel to all sorts of destinations, workshops, per diems, honorariums, all sorts of other expenses, and it's being spent on expenditure whose effectiveness in terms of service delivery is not proven. That is the issue. That is the issue. And accountants can do a lot of things in relation to that. One, the first cause of all this is over-optimistic revenue forecasting, which is related to 2 causes. One, having poor macro understanding of what the overall macroeconomic environment is going to be in the next year. That's not something that accountants can do a lot about. But the second cause is poor revenue administration. And that means what? That means poor tax audit. The inability of governments to go after the big taxpayers that are not paying what they should do. To go after leakages in customs, which is a huge issue with rent-seeking by customs officers who try to line their pockets rather than letting goods go through. Now, that's an issue of internal control. It's an issue of audit. It's an issue that accountants can help with. Moving on to payroll. I mean, I talked about payroll earlier. Payroll audits, controls over the payroll. That's an issue that accountants and auditors can help with. Internal controls over operating expenses. Again, something that we know a lot about as accountants and auditors. What are we doing about this? You know, which country is it, all the way from Nigeria to Cameroon to Angola to Tanzania to Mozambique, all these countries that are resource-rich, they're getting additional revenues. A lot of it is going to operating expenses. What are we doing about it? Okay. Then moving on to procurement. Of course, one of the key issues why capital budgets are not being spent is that there's a gap between the planning stage and the execution. At the planning stage, what we have is ideas of projects. Oh, it'd be nice to build a bridge over that river. Or it'd be nice to build a hospital over there. Or the president goes to visit a locality, and of course he announces that a new investment is going to be made. But that's an idea of a project. It's not a project. It doesn't have a proper estimate of the internal rate of return. It doesn't have a proper estimate of the cost of the project, and therefore it cannot be easily translated into a proper budget. That's what we have in a lot of African countries. We have ideas of projects that get written into the budget, and then when it comes to executing it, you realize that actually what you have in there is 40% of what you need, and so you can't go ahead. Also, you have issues with timing, that you don't release the cash on time. So these are all areas where accountants and auditors can help. Finally, on the private sector side, I would say that it comes down to how the PAOs are run. Are they run like a dungeon? Right? You have a barrier to entry, you need to become an auditor. Once you become an auditor, you bring down the gates you barricade yourself in your dungeon and you're inward looking. And it's about keeping people out. You know, it's about keeping people out. It's about ensuring that the cake is divided between those who are inside the dungeon. That's one way to run a professional accountancy organization. It's not a way that is either very sustainable or that leads to growth of the PAO or that leads to a very good branding. Another way to do it is to open the doors, to run it as an open organization, an organization that welcomes not just people in practice who are auditing, but also people in the private sector, people who are maybe in development agencies, who are auditors, you know, which opens the doors and the windows, which means greater fees being paid, which means greater sustainability of the business model of PAOs, which means also greater openness to the public, to issues of public interest, right, in politics. And if that model is being used, then there's a great deal that can be achieved.
Okay, so there's a lot we can do as a profession. Wherever you're working, whatever it is you're doing, there's a lot that you can do. I think that's the challenge that you're throwing back to the accountants, that as an auditor, as an accountant, as the one in charge of procurement, as the one who is doing the budget, as the one who is disbursing the money. I saw a lot of people laughing when you talked about honoraria, and I was about to ask, so how many of us got per diem when we came from wherever we came from? But let me give Michael a chance to quick comment, and then we'll go to the last two questions.
If I may, just quickly, picking on one of the issues that Renaud raised, very much to do with internal controls and failures in that direction. I think that leads and is consistent with the theme that who is operating those controls and what knowledge and what aspects and training have they received. And I think it comes back to proper training, which indeed comes back to the strong PAOs, making sure that it's fit for purpose. And it's accountants that actually the ethical part is critical. People that do the right thing even when no one is watching. And I think if this is inculcated at the training level, it stays with you for lifetime. So I come back just for 2 points in that case. One is repeating the concept of strong PAOs, critically important. But linked with that, what the PAOs have to do, how do we solve this? What do the PAOs have to do to make themselves more attractive, to attract into the profession the brightest people? Because they are in competition. And I do feel that a number of the PAOs have to focus on their image, their marketing, their branding, so that I'm not going to be a lawyer, I'm not going to be a doctor, I'm going to be an ethical accountant giving rigorous application of internal controls because for the good of my country. And I see that there's still work to be done in that area. And just moving slightly to the second point, which leads very much to a theme that seems to be developing and echoed by Anand this morning, is the stronger PAOs working together with perhaps those that need support across the continent, and picking Jean's theme, that actually it's not one size fits all, you know, what each country is at different developments. But I do think PAFA has a role to play here, looking at the PAOs, encouraging to support and help each other across boundaries. I know it's not easy, but certainly there's a journey to be had.
Okay, and I think the key word there is I want to be an ethical accountant. I don't want to be the accountant who comes in to enrich my pockets.
And cook the books.
Okay, so there was a question behind Jalil. I would want to take the gentleman who had put up his hand earlier. I'm trying to see. I talked about ladies. Where are my ladies?
Yeah, where are the ladies?
I can't see it. Is there a lady anywhere?
Oh, in front.
Let them just stand up. For the ladies, just stand up
There's one in front.
and take the mic. Okay, so there's one there,
Oh,
so
there's
you'll
the
be
lady
given the
from
mic
Mali.
and the one from in the front. But let's start with the one behind. We'll come
Myself?
to her. Yes, you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm trying to also manage time, so you'll bear with us.
Thank you. I thought because of my color you didn't see me. I'm Danny Luswili. I came under SIMA, CGMA, and originally from Zambia. Just for my question, he quoted an example of how money was distributed during the Ebola crisis, and then subsequently the money disappeared. And I would like your comment why you didn't do the due diligence, why not work with PMOs in that area, and before you distributed the money, ensuring that controls were in place rather than distribute first and then rush back to find the money is not fair. Your comment on that.
Okay, thank you, Danny. Let's get the question from the lady in the middle there. Please take the mic to the lady there, or you have a mic? Okay.
I have, thank
and then
you.
give her the mic.
Good day. My name is Cindy. I'm from Saipa, South Africa. I just would like to maybe get the opinion of the panel. How do we emphasize on ethical financial administration in an environment that is pressured by corruption, which seems to be underpinned by lack or limited resources? So the chase after the resources, it seems to define the culture of corruption. How do we inculcate responsible financial administration? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. Very good question. Let's have the last question.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, the panelists, for giving me this opportunity. I want to thank the panelists for the good contribution. I just want to say that for the African countries, we should have advocacy of letting our leaders, the political leaders, know that the PAOs have to be protected, because all professional accountants give the required advice, but it depends on the leadership, political leadership, will they take the advice. And that was why in the morning, the president of ANAN had said there is the protection that ANAN is trying to give to his members, but what level of protection can you give to a professional accountant to blow the whistle and get the boot from the government? There is a lot to be done by PAFA, there is a lot to be done by the PAOs, and individually for all professional accountants to be ready to do the right thing and face the music if it goes wrong. Thank you.
Okay, so contributing to Cindy's question on how you can act ethically and that the PAO can also do something, but I'll also ask the panel later on to give us their comments. So Danny said that I did not see him because he was too dark. I did see you. But there's a hand at the back there of somebody who's very white and cannot be missed. So we'll take his as the last question. No, behind. The person putting up their hand behind? Yes. So we'll take that as the last question.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Nicholas van Wyk from Cyber, and the whiteness is not my fault. It must have been my parents. My question relates to the suggestion by the World Bank on how the profession can be opened up. You mentioned two models. The one is the dungeon model, and the other one is opening up. Now, there's many aspects to that. In what way does the profession invite persons that studied, for example, engineering and end up as CFOs, or attorneys that adds an MBA to their qualification and ends in the finance division? Because our SMOs are very important and we need to adhere to them, but they're kind of very specialized in a particular area. If the World Bank can just explain what's the meaning of opening up and how far does this go? Thank you very much.
So how do we open up? How do we attract people into the profession? So I want to split those questions up. There's the question of how can you be ethical as an accountant, especially when you're facing so much pressure. And then the other question about attracting and then answering the issue of Ebola. So we'll start with, let me give Jean a chance on the question of ethical. How can you be ethical? And yet you're facing so much pressure as an accountant.
Okay, that is $1 million question, I think, because there is what you learn as part of the curriculum. I mean, Karen and I from Kenya, and this is a question that has come up time and again. And one of the discussions has been whether our education system really teaches people to be ethical, not just as accountants, but even just as citizens in the particular country. And maybe the question that I would like to throw back to PAOs when we're talking about, and it's not the PAOs that define, I presuppose, in all the countries, the curriculum, but in part of the curriculum, perhaps ethics should be one of the key subjects that we teach as part of that curriculum. And that's what I would like to say, and what the delegate from Nigeria also said, is that there has to also be, within the PAO, a whistleblower protection policy. So that if you have somebody who whistleblows, you have this at the global level of most governments. But if you have a whistleblower who blows the whistle, that the PAO has to come out very, very strongly to support that particular person. Because that is the challenge that we have, not just at the level of government, but also at the level of institutions, where people feel that there is no point of them whistleblowing because there'll be nobody to cover their back for them. And so that would be one of the things that I would suggest for PAOs to develop.
Okay.
A very clear policy, and also to implement that particular policy in the event that they have a whistleblower among their people.
So a tangible take-home for PAOs have a policy, but also a tangible take-home for ourselves as well. Other than just the curriculum having ethics, we also need to be ethical in ourselves in the first place. Anthony, any comments on that?
Yeah, I think the issue of, ethics crops out of corruption in terms of transactions, and you're faced with such, a dilemma where to go on it. But I also think that as accountants, we have tools to create transparency where we are. When investments are being appraised, we have tools such as cost-benefit analysis that we can use to see where the investment should go. So it's a two-way thing. We apply our tools to show the alternatives, and secondly, we have to be the trusted broker. Once there is that influence in the PAO is seen as a trusted broker, then you can protect people who actually, come out and speak about things going on, in organizations. If your members do not trust the confidence they have in you, it will be very difficult for them to be ethical, because at the end of the day, they might seek to protect, their jobs. But if we are seen as, a trusted broker, we are training our members to be ethical, and we walk the walk with them, we talk the talk with them, and we encourage whistleblowing. We give them the right tools to give alternatives in terms of procurement, arrangements, and all other issues. I think gradually we'll be making the step towards, having a much more ethical environment.
Okay, so thank you for that. Michael, I'll ask you there's a question of how can we be how open can we be as a profession? How can we attract as many to our profession, given that you need to strike a balance between being highly specialized and general training of accountants?
I think it's beholden upon accountants to know their skill sets and areas of expertise, and going with that, a corollary of their limitations. It's important that people only undertake work where they do have the right prerequisite of skills. And I include skills and technical aspects, but also the ethical aspect. Linking back to the previous question, I think it's important that individuals not only know the right thing to do, but act on it. And we have to change the position where people say, well, I can't afford to be ethical, to turn it round. I can't afford not to be ethical. And I think that's critical, and it links with the protection that was mentioned by other panelists as well. And I think we need to focus on that to get the right skills, the right training, and the right approach at the right time. So it opens it up at the same time as honing in on particular skills, whether it's banking, insurance, or specialisms.
Okay. Renaud, I think the last question, there was a clarification on the funding for Ebola. And you can also comment on the question that I've asked Michael.
Thank you very much. So thank you, sir, for your question on Ebola. let me reassure you that the World Bank is not in the business of handing out bags of cash. I wish, but no, we didn't do that. Actually, it was the government that, faced with the emergency, came up with whatever they thought would be the most expedient, and they thought it would be to pay people in cash. We came onto the scene after that, and we said, look, if you want us to be financing this, we're going to have to do it properly. And this is how we think we can do it in the circumstances. And that's how we set up the system, and we set up the controls. And we also noticed that there were some duplicate names. So people would come up with, because we requested lists of health workers, right, who were getting the hazard pay. And we ended up with a list that went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 14, 15, 16, 25. And they basically doubled the number of people who were supposed to be receiving the hazard pay, but we caught that. And the government also caught it with us. So just to say that, it's a process, and governments do what they feel they have to do when the house is on fire, right? But then it's about also preventing that from happening and investing in the quality of systems before the crisis happens. On the question of the gentleman from South Africa, regarding the two models. Look, it's the classic thing of, are you going to be just splitting the pie, or are you going to be growing the pie, right? If you're, there are some PAOs in Africa that only accept within their midst CPAs who are working in audit firms. They don't bring in CPAs in the private sector, they don't bring in CPAs who are working in development partner agencies or maybe in government. They're out of the picture. Or even CPAs who are from that country but outside the country. Yeah, so that's a lost opportunity for fees for that PAO. That means it's a lost opportunity for revenue, which means it's a lost opportunity for increasing the services that are provided to the members, increasing the quality of the services, and therefore increasing the value added of the profession, and therefore the perception by the users of financial statements. And so it's a huge opportunity loss. That's what I mean by opening up the profession. It doesn't mean taking in people who have no qualification. No, it means looking around and seeing what is at stake. It also means not just looking inward at the internal issues that people face when they are auditors in practice in audit firms, but looking around to society. What are the issues that are relevant to your citizens, and how can you contribute as a profession? Finally, I think I really like what Jean was saying on yes, you need whistleblower protections, you need sanctions. You need sanctions. You said it, Anthony, and I fully agree with that. How many sanctions have the PAOs represented in this room today issued in the past year? Can we do a show of hands? Can you any of you, if there have been sanctions issued by your PAO this year, can you raise your hand?
Yes, we have.
Yeah, we have a few hands. That's great. I think probably we need a few more. Next question as well. Positive sanction. How about role models? Why doesn't PAFA set up an Accountant of the Year award or something like that? I'm turning to the new PAFA president. Here's something you can do. It's not expensive, doesn't cost anything. It's just a matter of recognizing someone who's gone the extra mile, who's done the profession proud, and who can be a role model for others. These are just a few thoughts on the questions raised.
So the idea of celebrating our heroes and our sheroes, and
absolutely,
as a profession. And I like what you've mentioned about sanctions. It reminded me of, I recently visited one of my friends, and she's moved to a neighborhood where there's a bit of theft in the neighborhood. And she was telling me that the first time she moved her goods there, she didn't actually go in and live in the house. She just moved her stuff, and she was preparing, to move in the week after. And somebody broke in and stole a lot of the stuff from the house. And later on, she receives a call from her neighbor. And the neighbor says, you're my friend. And yes, I have got a family, but because you're my friend, I felt that I should tell you this. I've just gone into my son's room, and I've seen some of your stuff in his room. So it means that it's my son who actually broke into your house. And the lady asked this neighbor of hers, are you willing for us to call the police officers to come and arrest your son? And she said, yes, I'm willing to do it. Before they called the police, the father overheard the discussion. So he quickly ran to the son and said, you know, the police are coming for you, so you better take off. And I had a chance to sit with the two ladies. And the mother of the son, who's a thief, she said, you know, in fact, my daughter has challenged me. She's told me that, Mom, you're the one who made this boy become a thief. Because remember, when he was in primary school, he used to come home with other people's sweaters. He would come home with books that were not his, that you hadn't bought. And you never asked him anything. You were called to school, and you always went to school and defended your son. Is it any surprise that your son, as an adult, has continued the same habit and has become a thief? He was never sanctioned. He was never told what you're doing is wrong. So as a profession, as we manage the future, let's look at the young people who are coming into the profession. What are the values we are inculcating in them, even in your own house? It is only then that we can build a future generation of accountants who are ethical. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I would like to thank my panelists for a very fruitful discussion. I started off by saying that Africa Rising represents the opportunity of a lifetime. I believe that during this session and the subsequent sessions of the 2015 ACOA, we will get the tools, we will get the lessons, we will get the experiences that will enable us as a profession, both at the PAO level and at the individual level, to seize this opportunity within the lifetime of the opportunity. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome Mr. Clifford. I think you need to make an announcement. And there's also a board member to provide some gifts for the panelists. So apparently it's Vixon providing the gifts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. I'll just stay down here so everybody can hear me. Just some housekeeping issues to make the day better for tomorrow, because once we break down to the concurrent sessions, I won't have everybody together. Just in respect of delegates who are coming from the hotels, please be on time to catch the shuttle. And those people who are staying in, who do not have shuttles, there's a White Sand Tours desk outside, just opposite Anand booth. If you can advise them where you are staying, and then by this afternoon, we'll advise if we can provide you a shuttle, because it's really great to see all of you here, and we want you to have a great conference. So we'll try to make your all the transportation, everything smoother. Thank you very much.